Hello, thanks very much for joining us this afternoon. My name is Merle Massey, and I'm the coordinator for undergraduate research at the University of Saskatchewan. And our session today for the student undergraduate research experience is around issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And thank you very much for joining us today, everyone who's here. Just wanted to let you know that we're going to have a bit of an introductory session, and then we're going to put everyone out into rooms just to have a bit of an icebreaker and a chat. I will stop the recording at that point, and then I will start re-recording again when we come back together. But as always at the University of Saskatchewan, I would like to open with a land acknowledgement. And as we gather here today, we acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. We pay our respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm our relationship with one another. And with that, I would like to introduce our guest speaker, our special guest speaker for today. This is Dr. Andrea Rowe, and Dr. Rowe is the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Specialist with Global Water Futures. But with that, I don't want to say anything more than that. Andrea might have more that she'd like to say. So Andrea, over to you.
Okay, I'll start sharing my screen now, and hopefully you can see this here. Oh, can you see my screen there?
Yeah, we sure can. Looks great.
Perfect. So my name is Andrea Rowe, and I am the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Specialist at the Global Institute for Water Security and Global Water Futures at the University of Saskatchewan. And my pronouns are she and her. I joined the University of Saskatchewan in September of 2020, so not that long ago. And prior to coming to the U of S, I was the co-founder and chief research officer of a company called Feminuity that was founded at the Mars Discovery District in Toronto, Ontario. And I worked there for about 5 years, working with companies predominantly in the tech sector, but across a number of sectors, helping them to embed equity, diversity, and inclusion in the core of their business operations. My academic research was also on how to make national innovation systems more innovative by looking at gender equality and equity, diversity, and inclusion in that process. So I have both an academic and practical interest in equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so I know we only have 1 hour today to be here together, and I'm really excited to be talking about how to be a change maker. I think that this is a topic that we don't often get to reflect upon. EDI is so vast, there's so much to speak about. I think that this is a really interesting departure and a way to have a conversation about EDI. And so I'll just give you a quick overview of today's topics. So we thank you very much to Merle for the kind introduction and the land acknowledgement. I also wanted to reiterate that on my slide here as well. And then I thought what we could do is do a quick icebreaker if people want to. And then we'll come back and talk about key terms and concepts. And going into, specifically, I know many of you are interested in undergraduate research. So looking at what does EDI have to do with, research as a mindset? And one of my personal interests is how does that relate to innovation? And then we'll do sort of conclusion and questions. I also wanted to let you know that at the back of my presentation slide deck, which I'll make available by passing to Merle, is that there is going to be a whole bunch of references that I've kind of organized thematically. So if there's topics and themes that you want to follow up in, do a deeper dive into, and I've included not only academic papers, but also YouTube videos and practical resources, so that there's something in there for everyone, depending on how you like to learn about equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I don't know if it's possible for people to raise their virtual hands. You don't have to turn on your cameras. That's completely fine. You can if you want, but you don't have to. What I want to do in terms of an icebreaker is to break us into twos and to spend a couple of minutes, really only 5 minutes, sharing a story about a name that is significant to you with your partner. It can be a first name, a middle name, a last name, a nickname. And this is just an opportunity to share and hold space for someone else. So there's no right or wrong answer. The name can be funny. It can be a story that you want to share, but it's just an opportunity to connect. And so would anyone like to raise their virtual hand if you're okay doing this icebreaker? And if so, I'll go through one more slide and then we will break you into the breakout rooms. Oh, I see one hand. I see one hand. Given that we only have the one hand, I think maybe we will keep going through the talk then. Is that okay, Merle, if we just we'll pass over the icebreaker?
Absolutely, that's up to you. I do have the breakout rooms ready if you'd like to go ahead with that and give people a couple of minutes. I usually have a pretty good group that are willing to do that, so I'm absolutely willing to try.
All right, so we'll go one more slide here, and we'll do the breakout rooms. And if it doesn't work, we'll keep going. So, okay. When you're broken into a room with a partner, basically the questions that you can ask each other is, why is this name significant to you? Does this name have a literal meaning? Does the name have a cultural or religious significance? Is it connected to a story? So a story of friendship or family or something from your community. And it's absolutely totally okay if you don't know. Again, this is about creating and holding space for someone else in a safe way. There's no right or wrong answers, and you don't need to participate if you don't want to. But if you do want to, let's take 5 minutes. And Merle, if you would break us into breakout rooms, that would be great.
Absolutely. I'm going to press pause on the recording.
The interesting part about this activity is not that there's a right or wrong answer. It's just basically, if anyone would like to take a moment, to reflect upon, how did it feel to connect with another person, someone you don't know, someone you have just met. And the thing about a name is we all have one. We all have a name or a nickname or a family name that we can think of. And so it's an opportunity, especially I would have loved it if we were in person. I've only done this activity in person before. It's a way for people to feel seen and heard and just connect. And in our group, we had two Annies, because my family used to also call me Annie growing up. So, but the story of why people have the same name can be very different, and names are so personal. And so I think, my sort of rationale for doing this was just to give folks an opportunity to connect and to share a story with someone, and to be able to hold space for someone, which is something that we're going to come back to a little bit further on in the presentation. So one of the things that I think it's really important to think about when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion is, what does this actually mean? And so there are many definitions out there, and I'm not saying these are the right ones or the wrong ones, because there aren't. They're different. They're contextual, and I think that that's really the point. Is that diversity, equity, and inclusion can mean different things in different times and different spaces, and in different aspects of the literature. But I wanted to bring forward for you the definitions that we have used, the working practical definitions that we're using in the Global Water Futures Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Strategy for 2021 to 2023. And basically, what we wanted to highlight in that strategy is that diversity is a relational concept. No one person can be diverse on their own. And we're all diverse in our identities, experiences, relationships with each other. So thinking about diversity in terms of a relationship. And equity in this context means continuously challenging historically accepted ways of doing things, to give individuals the resources they need to be successful, rather than giving everyone the same tools and support. So the idea being that, equality would be giving everyone the same, and equity is giving people what it is they need. And then inclusion is about the quality of the experience that people have in their work environment, whether it's in a hiring process, a research team, classroom. Creating an inclusive environment means anticipating that people experience life and situations differently, and designing experiences to reflect those differences and needs. And so when we think about measuring diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is a topic that often comes up, there are quantitative measures that you could use to measure diversity. You could look at people's age, gender, sex, all of these things can be quantified in questions that you can ask. Ethnicity, languages spoken, there's all kinds of different ways, disability status, that you could use to measure diversity quantitatively. in terms of equity, similarly, you can also look at resources allocated, how much departments spend, how much of a budget goes to scholars who identify in different ways. And that would be a way of looking at equity quantitatively. And inclusion tends to be more of a qualitative set of measures. And so when we think about inclusion, it's not just about thinking about quantitative metrics, but it's also thinking about how do people qualitatively feel, and that this can change from moment to moment, experience to experience. And so although we have to continuously work on diversity, equity, and inclusion at all times, they're not distinct from each other. There's sort of differences in the ways that you would measure. And sometimes people talk about, the order of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or should it be EDI or DEI? And I think that, we've heard both things, that one, diversity is important to put first, but on the other hand, many scholars also say that, without equity, diversity can lead to tokenism. And so that we have to put equity first, and diversity should be a byproduct of treating people in an equitable way. So these are both certain things to think about when we think about EDI as a concept. And so with that said, how do we relate, what does it mean, to think about equity, diversity, and inclusion and being a change maker, particularly if you're an undergraduate student embarking on research? And I really like this definition by the Ashoka organization that says change makers are inquisitive, open-minded, and resourceful. Even when good things are happening within the status quo, they're not satisfied with the status quo because they have a vision for how to make things better. And I think that that's something that in the EDI space is really needed, that we have to, one, be aware of the challenges always, but we also have to think about how can we practically change and make things better. I think one of the things that I think about in terms of my own career path is my goal is to do myself out of a job when EDI positions will no longer be needed, because we will reach the place when people are treated equitably, we work in diverse environments, and we feel included, right? This should be the goal of this work, in my view. And so when we think about what does it mean to be a change maker, I wanted to highlight, the idea of ripples of change. And I'm using the water analogy because of my location in the Global Institute for Water Security and Global Water Futures. And one of the things that we've spoken about a lot and we have included in our EDI strategy is the idea that EDI work is nonlinear and includes multiple layers of work all at once. And so all of these things have to be happening at once for EDI to be successful. We have to have individual change. So as individuals, we have to be growing, learning how to confront our own bias, unlearning things that we may have learned in the past that are not true. I mean, in the context of truth and reconciliation, we're having a national collective unlearning in many cases of histories and things that simply are not true, that need to be replaced by the truth in order to have reconciliation and move forward. And also asking for help. Because I think one of the things that when we think about EDI work and what it means to be a change maker is recognizing that everyone is coming from a different place. And so what it's going to mean to engage in EDI and what it's going to mean to be a change maker is different for every single person. And that for some people, learning to ask for help can be a huge part of that journey of being a change maker. If you're a student that needs accommodation, it can be frightening to ask for accommodation, but actually doing that can be a huge part of being a change maker. Because by you doing that, it opens up the doors for others to follow in your path, seeing what you're able to do. And so I think it's important to recognize that we're all in different places, and what EDI means and how to engage with the concept of EDI depends on your position, depends on where you are in the university, depends on your own background. So we think about these sort of individual ripples of change. And when I think also about unlearning, I think it's also about changing some of the phrases or things that we grew up saying. There's many of us as we grow on our EDI journey will realize that certain phrases or things that are used in popular culture can be ableist or harmful. And so one of the ways of recognizing growth on your own path is, are you replacing things that can be hurtful? Like I often see in the media, there will be stories that say this story fell on deaf ears. And I often think that's not necessary. That's really ableist language. And so we could get towards, making the same point that the story, was not recognized. People, were not paying attention to this issue without having to say that it fell on deaf ears. And so I think, learning to upgrade our language and learning when we are being ableist or exclusive, and incorporating new ways of thinking and becoming more precise and sharp in our communication is a way of making individual change. And then when we move from that first droplet, from the individual to the interpersonal, this is where we can focus on making space for others, which, we tried to do in the virtual space at the beginning, which is, how do we make space? Active listening is a huge, huge part of equity, diversity, and inclusion, especially when you think about being a student in a lab or working on a team. Being able to hold space for other people to be able to share their stories and experiences and their thoughts, communicate with others and give their perspectives is a big part of contributing to that feeling of an inclusive environment. And so part of how we can, improve in our interpersonal skills is working on our communication skills. Communication skills, like all skills, require effort. And that's not always effort that's been put in, especially in particular programs. I'm sure those folks that are studying communication right now know what I'm saying. And, intercultural competence and intercultural communication as well. For many folks coming to university is the first time they're really working in a very international environment. And so this can also be an opportunity to learn new skills and to learn new ways of communicating with others to help create that inclusive environment. And we think about social. This is, one level up from that direct interpersonal contact, but what is the sort of larger social context? And this is where we start thinking about networks and opportunities and data. And so this is where, we can start to think about, do students have the opportunity to be mentored in their field of research? Are we making sure that they know what conferences and events are available for them to attend, to meet folks that share common research interests and ideas? And so that they can come together and be part of these groups and see their communities grow beyond their immediate lab or classroom or interpersonal social group, but start to feel connected in other realms and other ways. Because over time, this is what we see contributes to inclusion in academia and the university in the long run. And this might come more naturally to students that have family members that are academics or siblings or good friends. They know how to engage. But for people like myself who don't come from an academic family, or it's your first generation in the university, you might not know that these opportunities are open to you, even as an undergraduate in many cases. And so it's important to share information with people in an equitable way so that everyone knows that these opportunities are available, not just people who have, a mom or dad who's a professor. And then when we think about economics, this is another layer of ripples of change. And for those folks that are in administrative roles, it's thinking about how do we spend money and resources and who does this go to? Because that's a huge part of who ultimately feels included in the university, is whether or not people have economic opportunities to do their research and to stay engaged in academic life. And finally, as a researcher, one of the things that many researchers think about is how will their research be used? And does this contribute to advocacy, changes in laws, contribute to justice, more broadly speaking? And so these are things about when we think about ripples of change. EDI work is happening on all of these levels all the time. And so it's not linear. We move back and forth between thinking about the big picture, advocacy and justice issues, and to individual issues. How can I keep changing and growing within myself? And so when we think about EDI and a research mindset, I think this is one of the things that is really interesting about thinking about EDI as an undergraduate researcher who's just beginning your research career. And when you're a student, you're often thinking about learning from and taking in literature and knowledge that has been produced by others. And once you begin researching, that's when you begin the production of knowledge for others to learn from. And so this is the point where we can start to integrate equity, diversity, and inclusion into every aspect of how you begin to take on a research question. And I recognize that as an undergraduate, you may not actually be at the place to have control over many of these things. You may be working on a project where the research questions, the methods, they're predetermined. But even within that context, it's really worthwhile to start thinking about it so that when you do have the opportunity to define your undergraduate thesis or design a research project for a course, you're prepared and have that critical mindset to be able to think about EDI in the work that you do. And so when we think about research questions, even designing the research question, we have to think about whose ideas and interests and experiences are represented in the research question. And for some folks in the social sciences, this might be very obvious, but this question is equally as important if you're in the natural sciences or in medicine or in engineering, where your work might be much more detached from people. And so it might require a lot more critical thinking to consider whose ideas and interests are represented in even asking this question. But by stepping back and doing that consideration, it can lead you to a much sort of larger group of questions about, have I engaged, for example, with Indigenous communities? Am I doing this research, in partnership with organizations and people that are going to be affected by its outcomes, which is much later down the path. So it's really important to think about EDI, even when the project is not yet defined, before it's defined, because once it's defined and it's funded and it's in process, it's much harder to change. And so once we have the research question defined and we think about what community is involved in that work, then we can think about EDI in the research method. And so many of you may be taking training or will be taking training in quantitative and or qualitative research methods. And some programs are more amenable to people using mixed methods, so using both quantitative and qualitative approaches, but some programs are not. They're much more quantitative or they're much more qualitative. And so it's really important to think about the fact that different methods can yield very different results, even on the same topic. And so if you're pursuing a quantitative path, it's still worth thinking about and searching out literature. What do we know qualitatively on this topic? And what does that tell us about communities involved or not involved? Whose voice is being heard in these academic debates and whose voice is missing? And that may in part be because of the questions that are being asked, who is asking the question, but also the methods being used. And so once we think about, the relationship between equity, diversity, and inclusion and designing the question, the method that's being used, and now we go out and do the research and we have some findings, it's also important to think about, well, how are we going to share these findings? And how are we going to communicate them to other people? And so are we making every effort to make sure that they're accessible? Are they communicated just through academic publications, or are they communicated in other ways that might reach communities, reach youth, be presented through art or other means? So I think that that's something that is certainly, how EDI can thread through the sort of entire research process. And I think that, the mindset of a researcher that wants to be a change maker is that you have to keep coming back at every stage of the process to think, how are we thinking about EDI? It's not a sort of one and done thing or something that you put in the grant application and then you can kind of forget, right? It's something that you have to keep coming back to at every step of the work. I just want to say, if anyone has any questions and they want to interject, please feel free. I'm happy to take questions as we go, or at the end, it's also fine.
You can also put them in the chat and I'll be happy. If you don't want to speak them out loud, you can put them in the chat and I'll read them out for Dr. Rowe.
And so one of the things that's really interesting when we think about research is that research can lead to innovation, hopefully, right? And that's one of the things that, when we think about equity, diversity, and inclusion, we can think about it in many different ways. But one of the things that's really interesting now, people have had this, I think, hunch or feeling for a long time, but there's a paper that came out in 2020 that looked at over 1 million graduate theses in the United States from 1977 to 2015. And it was able to show that, using artificial intelligence was how the study was done. And it was able to show that demographic diversity breeds novelty, and especially historically underrepresented groups in science introduce novel recombinations, but their rate of adoption by others is lower and suggests their novel contributions are discounted. And so what this means is that bringing our whole selves to work, bringing our diverse perspectives, life experiences, ideas, cultural backgrounds, language spoken, does lead to more innovative academic work. And this study was able to show that many people that have won Nobel Prizes, including Canadian Donna Strickland, a very well-known scholar in the United States, Londa Schreibinger, they were the first to find novel combinations of words in their graduate dissertations. They were the first to put certain concepts together. And so I think it really speaks to why it's important to create inclusive teams, to be able to hold space for each other, for people to be able to speak up and share their true thoughts on their research, and to be able to come back to this point and to question, why are we researching this question? What research method are we using? How are we going to communicate these findings? Because it really does matter. If we all, and we think in academia that we're really open to critical debate, and I mean academic debate, that's why we're here. But oftentimes people that come from equity deserving groups are less likely to be able to speak up or silenced more quickly when they do. And so it's really important to be able to hold space for each other and to listen to what each other is saying, because it does contribute not only to an overall better human experience, it also contributes to innovation. And I think one of the things about innovation that I'm really passionate about is that through innovation, we're recreating the future in front of us. And we all know that we have many, many challenges. If anyone is watching COP26 this week and engaged in the UN Sustainable Development Goals, we know that we have huge global challenges that we need to face together. And so we need to be able to come together and find ways to take on those challenges. And EDI is a huge part of that process and part of that journey, because we haven't yet met the people that are going to solve these challenges, I think. And I hope many of you are on this call and beginning your degrees now, because I think your work is so important. And hopefully as institutions, we will be able to create the spaces where people can thrive. And so the second piece of that quote, which is the sadder piece, is that although people from more diverse backgrounds are statistically more likely to innovate, those ideas are less likely to become adopted in academia. And so that tends to have, as the article finds, a negative impact on people's career paths, because people need to not only recognize your work, but to cite it, to reference it, to use it in order for your academic career to have momentum. And so one of the things that I like to say about something that you can do, not only to hold space for others, to speak their truth, to share their ideas, but to become an early adopter of innovation. You know, if you're the kind of person who loves new ideas and really takes those up and takes the time to learn things that are different than what is the accepted way of doing things, and then references those articles, it can have a powerful impact on the career trajectory of the people that have innovated those ideas. And so becoming an early adopter not only will push your own scholarship, but it's a way of also helping folks to get the recognition that they deserve for coming up with those novel ideas. And of course, on an institutional level, there's a whole other range of things that institutions need to do, but I just want to focus on the individual change maker aspect of today and what we can do personally. And that is one of the things. And I think one of the contrast to becoming an early adopter is the idea of resistance. And so many of you might be researching in areas where they are more resistant to change. And so, one of the examples that's sort of a classic example in the EDI world is that of the auto industry. So the auto industry has known for more than 40 years that vehicles are not as safe for people that don't have a standard male body, and that to this day, almost all car safety testing is done on crash test dummies that are of a male size and bone density. And so unfortunately, vehicles are not as safe for smaller people with lighter bone density, for children. And when you buy a car with a safety rating, that safety rating is actually only really ranked against a male crash test dummy, or the body of a male figure. And so this industry, you know, in a way, even though they have the knowledge, there's many people that have worked on this, particularly at Volvo in Sweden, to dislodge this idea and thinking about, you know, how do we do this? The industry as a whole has been resistant to incorporating EDI in the products and processes and services that they offer. And so I think it's really an interesting example of how there can be a disconnect between those ripples of change, between, you know, individual change is just as important as, you know, an entire industry. Because why don't we have that change in the auto industry, for example, in terms of safety? And it comes down to all of those different levels of change that are required to actually change the outputs and the outcomes for people. And so I think it's important on an individual level when you're a change maker to recognize when you're working in a resistant environment, and to recognize that that happens, and that it's not to leave the environment, but to recognize that, you know, there's nothing wrong with thinking something different, and trying to build teams of people that are willing to be inclusive and to innovate and to actually shift those industries. I know I certainly would like to buy a car with an inclusive EDI rating if I was going to buy a car. Probably not going to buy a car, but if I was, that would be something that I would be very interested in. And I think the other thing is complexity. You know, EDI work is incredibly complex. That there, I don't have quick and easy answers. Unfortunately, this work involves multiple layers, multiple stakeholders, and so as individual change makers, we have to recognize that we're often working in environments that are not designed for equity, diversity, and inclusion, and that there are trade-offs within every choice that we make. And so I think one of the interesting things here that I've chosen as an example is renewable energy, right? So you can be an engineering team that has designed this absolutely, you know, wonderful technology to create renewable energy and have such a powerful impact on the environment. But the way that it's deployed, if it's, you know, the wind towers are put up in an indigenous community, and that wind tower prevents communities from being able to access their land, it's now no longer, you know, an equitable or inclusive innovation. It now becomes something that actually, you know, entrenches exclusion and hierarchies and colonization, et cetera, right? And so I think that really speaks to the point of why EDI in research is not only about, you know, how do we conceptualize it, how do we produce it, how do we you know, create research and innovation, which is the products and processes and services that come out of research, but then also how do we deploy those things, and recognizing that this is a continual process. And that's often where we see the breakdown, is that, you know, you could have an engineering company that invests a lot in EDI, but they don't ultimately deploy their innovation in an equitable way. And so we need to get better as a society and as a world and as academics, not only thinking about how do we generate these ideas, but then how will they be used, and thinking that through at a much earlier stage. And so one of the terms that has often come to be used to talk about that type of thinking is sustainability. But even there, we have to unpack and question underlying assumptions about what is being sustained and for whom. And so when we bring an EDI lens to sustainability, it allows us to think about, you know, where is there resistance? What is the complexity in this situation? And what are we sustaining and for whom? You know, are we sustaining consumption, or are we sustaining, you know, nature? Or what are we sustaining, and how and why? And so these are types of questions that I know will all be very different depending on the field in which you research. And I think I tried to make these examples kind of something that might speak to you, whether you're in the natural sciences or social sciences or medicine or arts, because I think that these are all questions that we'll have to confront as we think about EDI and a career path as a researcher. And so, yeah, I've left lots of time for questions and conclusions. Would anyone like to jump in with some questions before I make any closing remarks?
I'll watch the chat, and if anyone wishes to put theirs into the chat and I can read it out, that's fine. But Dr. Rowe, I am quite curious to know, if you had one thing that you wanted all of us who are listening to you today to change, to address our own ability to be a change maker, what would that one thing be?
I think start the journey. I think that start the journey. I think that for everyone, that's going to look very different. And for some people, being on an EDI journey is really investing in their own self-care, right? It's investing in their own self-care so that they have the energy to come and do their research and to be a student and to do your work. And that can be part of being an EDI journey if you are, a woman, or you are new to Canada and an international student, or you're a student with a disability. I think, don't be afraid to take advantage of the resources and things that are there for you. Be willing to ask for assistance. And, I think that can be one really powerful way to engage in EDI. I think for folks that are in leadership roles, I think it's really important to make time in your schedule to learn as much as you can. I think that the pressures of academia to always be producing, the worst time to really learn is when you're under lots of pressure, right? And so I think take time to learn as regularly, as often as you can, about different aspects of EDI, because I really haven't, even scratched the surface. And I think that's what I'll talk about a little bit more in the conclusion, is where there's some good places to learn and keep taking steps.
I think that's absolutely brilliant. If I could ask a follow-up question, in terms of being within, I'll give you a scenario and then ask what you think a student would do. In this scenario, there's a student who's working in a lab, a research lab, and there's someone working above them who maybe said something that caused some hurt or caused some harm, or made some assumptions that are around EDI, that directly related to EDI, that were quite problematic. Suggestions on what that student could potentially do in that situation. How do you influence to power?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to think about is the idea of calling in versus calling out. And so oftentimes what we see in social media, or on various social platforms, et cetera, is the idea of calling out people, calling out when people say the wrong thing, or calling out when people do the wrong thing. And sometimes this is the right thing to do, particularly in a political context, when people are calling out governments, for example, and saying you need to change a policy. But when we think about, in a classroom setting or a lab setting, when the main goal is to maintain your social bond with the people that you're working with, it's not to call them out and to create distance. It's actually to continue working together. One of the more powerful things can be to call in. And so to wait for a moment when you're able to speak to that person alone. And if you can, express to them, that what wasn't right for you. If someone calls you by the wrong name, or says something that they shouldn't have said, try to explain to them, why that wasn't the best opportunity. But I think one of the things as well that we have to consider is that this is not always possible. And so sometimes you might need to speak to someone who's an ally. You might need to speak to someone who could support you, and maybe they can speak to that person on your behalf, because it is really important to consider your own safety and comfort. And particularly, if you are a person who, finds that you're often the only one in the room, or that you find that this is often the burden of teaching people is being put upon you, it's not your burden. It's their burden to learn. And so I think it is important to be able to reach out and I think for students to be allies for each other, to try and learn about each other's experiences, because it can often be very powerful. For example, if a man sees sexism happening in the lab, it's often very powerful for him to say, hey, I don't think that was okay, more so than the person who is the target of the sexism. And there's some research around why that is. And so it's important also for us to become attuned to each other's experiences, and to be able to not speak up for people, but if someone asks you to speak up for them and to be able to interrupt the bias, that you become more confident to do so. And we have offered certain trainings in the Global Water Futures Network around interrupting bias, because it is a complicated thing. But I can strongly recommend looking at the work of Dr. Stephanie Goodwin. She has a lot of interesting information about how to safely interrupt bias and address these issues when they happen.
Thank you. Those were both really, really wonderful responses to my questions. And I was hoping to see a few come in through the chat, but it could be that people just want Merle to be quiet and for them to ask the questions, and that's okay too. So I will be quiet.
Yeah, if we don't have any questions right away, I think what I'll do is just show you a little bit about the resources that I've included, because I know today when we think about, what does it mean to be a change maker? There's so much more to EDI than what we can cover in 1 hour. And so I wanted to include here the link to the University of Saskatchewan's inaugural Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Day. That all of those videos are available online, and there was excellent presentations by folks from the University of Saskatchewan and guest presenter Dr. Melinda Smith from the University of Calgary. And I strongly recommend that you watch those talks to really get a much more in-depth understanding of equity, diversity, and inclusion. Also, if you haven't yet read the University of Saskatchewan, the strategy that was gifted on behalf of Indigenous people to the University of Saskatchewan, Let's Fly Up Together, I strongly recommend that you read that as well. Not that equity, diversity, and inclusion, it is separate from indigenization at the university, absolutely, but I think it's important to be learning on all of these topics together because although they're distinct, continuous learning is part of both processes. And I've included some other resources, on how to be a change maker. There's a lot more to that as well. The idea that, simply doing good is not good enough. And that in life, we need to focus a lot more on what is the actual impact on people, not the intention that we set out with. And that can often be a challenge in EDI work. We can often get caught up in, well, I wanted to do the right thing, but when the impact isn't actually there, we need to be able to pivot and to actually make sure that the impact is what we're going for. I've also included the Global Water Futures EDI strategy and another case for an intersectional approach to EDI, in case any of you were thinking about strategies and the ways of organizing EDI within your own work units. That may be helpful to you in terms of the structure that we have used there to make those ripples of change into something more structured and organized that can be actioned. And in terms of also the research mindset, I recently came across this film by Patagonia Films that some of you may or may not have watched yet, that it's called Run to Be Visible by Lydia Jennings to honor Indigenous scientists past, present, and future. This is an absolutely wonderful film. It's only about 18 minutes long, but I highly recommend that as something to watch. If you want to see, the journey of someone doing their PhD and how they've brought together their own life experience with their academic discipline and the impact that has, because I think of the visual of a film can be incredibly powerful in understanding what does this journey really look like in practice. A couple of other research resources that I love is the book Factfulness by Swedish researcher Hans Rosling. And this is really, if you're interested in quantitative data and how EDI intersects with quantitative data and why we need to have quantitative metrics to really understand the world around us, that's an excellent read. Also, I think the concept of intersectionality is just absolutely key in the research mindset. It's something that we all have to think about in terms of not only how do things like socioeconomic status, race, gender, age, location, how do they impact the way that systems treat people, and research is part of that. It's really a critical concept to know and understand. And furthermore, when we think about innovation, the applying a gender lens to the interlinkages with the UN SDGs is really, really important. I think that this document does take an intersectional approach, and it really looks at, how do we leave no one behind in the process of innovating and trying to achieve the 2030 goals. And so I think that those are some of my sort of favorite resources, and there's many, many more here, but I think the sort of common theme amongst them is really thinking about, different types of research, whether you're in medicine or science or engineering. What do, inserting EDI thinking, how does that actually change the outcome? How does it make for better science? And I mean, I often like to think about the way that adding EDI to research gives us a 360 perspective, right? Instead of just looking at, well, how does this research impact one identity? We look at, well, how does this actually impact everybody? And so ultimately we get more precise scientific findings that have a sharper impact. And I promised at the very beginning when we did the icebreaker that we'd come back to holding space. And so I wanted to end this sort of package of resources with some information on psychological safety. And this is a concept that many of you might be aware of, but the researcher Amy Edmondson has an excellent YouTube video on how to turn a group of strangers into a team. And she also has many books and journal articles, but if you're interested in the idea of, well, how do I help to turn, my lab into a team where people feel included, that's a really great place to start. And also the idea of active listening and how active listening can really help all teams, as is shown in the previous video, but also when we're working across diverse cultures, recognizing that we don't all engage with each other in the same way. And so being able to actively listen and to show up and to hold space for people is another way that we can not only increase a sense of inclusion, but really increase our own learning and making sure that we're truly hearing what people have to say. So I think that's the package that I wanted to leave you with, so that you have some further things to dive into. And I've included the gwfedi@usac.ca email. If you have any questions or comments, you can find me, or you can send messages to that account, and we'll be happy to get back to you as well.
Thank you so much. That was just phenomenal. I really appreciated how you framed everything today and how you spent time breaking it down at the different levels. I really liked the imagery around the drop of water and the ripples and all of these ripples happening at once. And I thought that was really excellent. And so I want to join with everyone else to say thank you for being with us today. I'm going to stop the recording, but if there are other questions that people would like to ask that you don't want to be on the recording, that would be just fine. But a round of applause and a big thank you to Dr. Rowe for sharing with us her experiences and her knowledge around EDI and giving a few of us some ideas of our path forward on this journey. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm happy to stay behind and answer any questions once the recording is done if people just want to ask one-on-one. That's great. Thank you so much for having me.